Pizarro's signal came, the falconets were lit, and not a single shot scattered the crowd. On November 16, 1532, in the great square at Cajamarca, Atahualpa entered carried on his litter, but he did not enter the way his hosts expected. His generals had warned him. Quizquiz had taken Cusco, Chalcuchimac had broken Huasca's armies, and these veterans did not trust a band of bearded strangers who hid inside buildings and asked for a meeting. So the emperor kept his warriors armed. Tens of thousands of men, slings and clubs and bronze-tipped spears held ready, filled the plaza and the approaches behind it. In the real history, Atahualpa walked into that square with a lightly armed retinue, expecting a parley, and within hours he was a prisoner and his men were dead in their thousands. In this alternate timeline exploration, we examine what could have happened and why the real history unfolded differently. When the friar Vicente de Valverde approached with his breviary and his interpreter, and Atahualpa cast the book to the ground, Pizarro gave the order. The cavalry burst from the buildings, the cannon roared into the press of bodies. For a heartbeat, it was the massacre history remembers. Then the square held. The Inca did not break and run. Disciplined, forewarned, packed too tightly to panic, they closed inward around the horses. What no one in that plaza understood, what would take years to grasp, was that the shape of two continents had just turned on the angle of a single morning. A horse is terrifying only until it is surrounded. In the crush of the square, the animals could not gather speed, and a charge that cannot move is only a tall target. Slings found the riders, spears found the mounts. The guns fired once, perhaps twice, and could not be reloaded in the swarming dark of bodies. Within the hour, the bulk of Pizarro's 168 were dead, and Francisco Pizarro himself was among the fallen. A handful broke free and fled toward the coast, and the Inca, who knew every league of their own roads, ran them down. They were not all killed. The generals had given an order more valuable than vengeance: take some alive. Down the long descent to the sea, the columns pursued the survivors, and they brought back prizes: steel swords still bright, a few coughing horses, sacks of black powder, and a small number of Spaniards and their indigenous auxiliaries kept breathing for one reason. The court wanted to know where the strangers had come from, how many more there might be, and what these tools of theirs truly were. The interrogations began on the road and would continue for years. You cannot copy what you do not yet understand. At Cajamarca and then at Cusco, the empire's finest smiths bent over the captured materiel like men reading a foreign script. The Inca worked bronze and gold with real mastery, but iron was a different argument with the earth. It demanded heat they had never needed to reach, and the first attempts to forge blades from melted Spanish steel produced brittle, uneven things. Progress came slowly and unevenly, a few good blades for every dozen ruined ones. The horses were a separate education. Captive farriers, trading knowledge for their lives, taught the keeping and feeding of the animals, and the first Andean riders learned to stay mounted on terraced ground, never built for hooves. Gunpowder was the hardest secret of all. Charcoal they had, saltpeter could be gathered, but the proportions, the grinding, the corning that made powder burn fast rather than merely smolder, these were learned by failure, sometimes fatal failure. None of it spread evenly. A workshop in Cusco might forge a passable sword while a frontier town had never seen one. The empire was not handed a new age. It was made to earn each fragment of it. A throne is heaviest the day after it is won. Atahualpa now ended the succession war entirely on his own terms. Huasca was already his captive. The northern claimant became the undisputed Sapa Inca, and the generals who had saved him in the square, Chalcuchimac, Quizquiz, Ruminyahui, were raised high in his favor. The civil war that had torn Tawantinsuyu in the years after smallpox killed Huayna Capac was closed, and closed by victory rather than by foreign conquest. But a Bronze Age empire was not built to feed an Iron Age army. The roads, the storehouses, the Quipu-counted tribute of maize and cloth and labor, all of it had been engineered for a world of slings and llamas, not of forges that devoured charcoal and horses that ate as much as 10 men. To arm even a few units in the new way strained the logistics of the whole realm. The emperor had won his house. Holding it would cost more than any battle had. The deadliest invader never carried a sword. Smallpox had crossed into the Andes ahead of the Spanish themselves, killing Huayna Capac and his heir Ninan Cuyuchi around 1527 and lighting the very civil war that Atahualpa had just ended. Winning the square changed nothing about this. The pathogens did not care who held Cajamarca. Measles and typhus would follow the same roads the armies marched, and the people of the Andes had no acquired immunity to any of them. So even in triumph, the population thinned. The same workforce that the new defenses depended upon, the smiths, the porters, the farmers who filled the storehouses, was the workforce the diseases hollowed out. A victory on the battlefield could not be undone, but neither could it be enjoyed. The empire that survived Pizarro would spend the coming years burying its dead in numbers no army could ever have inflicted. That, too, the strangers had brought. The news that should have warned them only tempted them. Word of Pizarro's annihilation crossed the sea slowly, carried by rumor and by the few who had stayed on the coast, and it reached the Caribbean governors, and eventually the Spanish crown, not as a caution, but as an advertisement. An expedition of fewer than 200 men had been destroyed by a kingdom rich enough in gold to make any soldier's eyes burn. To the men who had carved up the Caribbean and toppled the Mexica, a defeat was not a closed door. It was proof that there was something behind the door worth taking, and so the disaster did its strange work. It transformed a small private venture's failure into an imperial ambition. Plans were drawn for a second expedition, larger, better armed, better led. The question in the harbors of Panama and Seville was no longer whether to go, but how many to send. The Andes had bought time. It had not bought peace. Knowing the enemy will return is itself a kind of weapon. This time the Inca court was not surprised, and surprise had been the stranger's sharpest blade. Atahualpa's generals turned to the coast, the place where ships would come. Ruminyahui drilled the new mounted units and the crude gun crews on prepared ground, choosing the passes and the river crossings where horses lost their advantage and slings kept theirs. Coastal approaches were watched and fortified. The long roads that had carried Inca armies so swiftly now carried warning faster than any sail. The hardest front was not military, but political. The coastal and frontier ethnic lords, peoples, the Inca had absorbed by force or persuasion, were exactly the ones a foreign power would court first, as Pizarro's own kind had done so well elsewhere. The court worked to bind their loyalty before the next contact, with marriage, with tribute relief, with the plain demonstration that the strangers could be killed. Whether that loyalty would hold under fire, no one could yet say. And then came the sails on the horizon that would test every preparation at once. The second expedition came expecting a conquest and found a war. The ships were more numerous now, the men better equipped, the commanders forewarned of what had befallen Pizarro, and still the Andes that met them was not the one their predecessors had described. Here horses charged out of the high passes ridden by Andean cavalry. Here muskets, however crude and few, answered from behind stone walls. Here the ground had been chosen and prepared, the storehouses stocked, the lords mostly held. The shock that had won Cajamarca for the Spanish in our timeline could not be repeated against an enemy who already knew the trick. It did not become an easy Inca victory. The newcomers still carried better steel, deadlier guns, and the diseases that kept killing on both sides of every battle line. What it became was something history had not seen in the Americas, a contest, prolonged and uncertain, between two powers that had each learned hard lessons from the other. The conquest that real history records as swift and almost accidental became, in this telling, a long and open question. And that is the quiet lesson of the square at Cajamarca. Empires do not always fall in an afternoon, and sometimes the difference between a footnote and a survival is only that someone, this time, listened to the warning.